Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the course. We've just finished the module on Keynesian economics. And to be clear, Keynesian economists want to create a free market economy, that is, a capitalist economy. How do you do that? You create private property as much as you can. You make every good into a privately owned tradable good as much as you can. But even when you maximize the amount of those privately tradable goods in the economy that you've created, you will have something, according to Keynesians, called market failure. So market failure causes economies not to work as they should, they don't go to equilibrium, and that requires an institution to come in and adjust the market. And usually that institution is presumed to be the government. Now, we're going to start on our next section, which is environmental and ecological economics. And yes, those are two different things. We're going to start with environmental economics. And as you will see, it is very similar to Keynesian economics, except it just tends to look more at environmental impacts and market failures that specifically involve the natural environment. So let's turn to that now. So this is the big picture as far as environmental economics is concerned. Environmental economics, as I just mentioned, is very similar to Keynesian economics. It begins with the neoclassical model. You've got your Homo economicus wanting to maximize their utility, operating within a market system. There's supply, there's demand. It assumes that human wants are unlimited. Right? So Homo economicus wants more and more and more. And Keynesian economics and environmental economics that follow it privileges private property and human interaction that occurs through markets. That's where they presume you'll get your economic efficiency that will lead to growth. And it's presumed that economic growth has better outcomes for all sort of facets of human life. The problem for environmental economists is they do admit that markets can fail. So for environmental economics, it's about looking at where markets can be created to maybe improve efficiency and improve allocations so there's less harmful environmental effects. And also, when markets tend to fail, it's about patching up those markets and making sure they don't fail anymore and hopefully create a Pareto optimal outcome through government intervention. So here is the basic big picture model. You've got Homo economicus. They are selfish by design. They want to improve their situation and they interact through markets. They buy or sell goods and services, whether they're buying a laptop computer, whether they're buying a cell phone or stocks on the stock market or a vacation, a trip, anything like that. That's how they interact with society. So Homo economicus essentially makes a choice. Economics is the study of human choice under scarcity when there's costs associated to the choices that you make. Homo economicus makes a choice thinking that they're maximizing their own utility. That goes into a market. They purchase something for a price on that market, but oh no, there's market failure. That market failure has an outcome, and the outcome of that is harm to the environment. So what do you do in that situation? That is the realm of environmental economics. But they start with Homo economicus, they go through markets, and then they see this sort of adverse outcome, and they want to fix that. There are key concepts to environmental economics. One, Homo economicus. We already discussed. He has unlimited wants, stable preferences, and makes choices. Number two is the idea of scarcity. Resources are limited. There's time that's limited, energy is limited, money is limited, and land is limited. So you can't have everything you want. So you have to decide what are the things that you want. How do you do that? Well, that's a choice. You have to make a choice. What should I do? What should I buy? Every time you make a choice, according to any type of mainstream economics or Keynesian or environmental economics, anytime you make a choice, there's an opportunity cost. That's the thing you don't get when you make your choice. It's the value of the best alternative that is foregone when making the choice that you make. So, for example, maybe I love cotton candy here. And look at me, I'm very happy. I have $5 and I could buy cotton candy. However, I also very, very much love merry-go-rounds. So my opportunity cost for that $5, assuming these two goods are the same price, for that $5, my opportunity cost of using that $5 to buy myself cotton candy is I forgo a trip on the merry-go-round. That's opportunity cost. And that's the economics of choice that we face in every economic decision. Now, how do I make that choice? Well, I buy additional units of the thing I like until the marginal benefit I receive from having that thing equals its marginal cost. The marginal benefit. So every time I buy a cotton candy, I must be buying that because I think I'll get a benefit. And maybe I value that $5. So I look at the cost, the marginal cost, and it's $5. Marginal cost is usually the price. So I'll buy that. So this is my marginal benefit. How much joy or utility I get from buying one more thing. The marginal cost is how much that one more thing costs me. In a normal market, when you're a consumer, that's just the price. That's the cost of buying one more thing. Let's use an example. It'll be pretty simple. Let's use this cotton candy example. Imagine the marginal cost of buying an additional unit of cotton candy is $5. In other words, that's how much cotton candy costs. Okay, here's me. I get a marginal benefit from one cotton candy that I would equate to $7. I really like cotton candy in this case. So will I choose to buy cotton candy at the marginal cost, at the price of $5? Yes, I will. As I eat another cotton candy, here in this picture I'm quite happy and I have two, that second cotton candy I actually don't enjoy very much. That's the law of diminishing benefits, right? Diminishing returns. As I eat another one, I've already had one, so I don't enjoy it that much. But presumably I enjoy it equal to $5. So my first cotton candy, I got $7 worth of enjoyment out of that in my own evaluation. For the second cotton candy, I still get benefits from that, but only $5 worth. And lucky for me, cotton candy costs $5, so I will buy that. Yeah, I'm going to buy that cotton candy. I get $5 of enjoyment out of it, and it only cost me $5. But then the third one, of course, my enjoyment, my benefit is still diminishing. So now I only get $3 worth of benefit or enjoyment out of that third cotton candy. But the cotton candy, the marginal cost is still $5. The price is still $5. So will I buy that third cotton candy even though it makes me less happy than just keeping the money? That's my opportunity cost. No. Actually, in our example, I would probably take that money and go ride the merry-go-round instead of buying a third cotton candy. So the market will reach equilibrium in our little example when I have purchased two cotton candies. So that's how we determine our equilibrium price. All of the benefits of that cotton candy purchase are included in my marginal benefits, and all the costs are included in the price. So we can figure out what the optimal amount of cotton candy is for me to purchase. And you can ramp that up to a whole market. The optimal amount of cotton candy for the market to purchase at a certain price will be figured out in this exact way. But what if there's a market failure? And the main market failure that environmental economists focus on are externalities. So let's look at those again. You'll remember this from talking about Keynesian economics. An externality is an uncompensated cost or benefit of an economic activity that affects a third party not directly involved in the transaction. So you sell cotton candy, I buy cotton candy, that's two parties in the transaction. But somehow when I'm purchasing that cotton candy, what if somebody gets injured or hurt or loses money because of that? That would be an externality. So let's look at that. We make decisions based on our own private costs and our private benefits for ourselves, but we don't count the impact on the environment or on society. So that would be an externality that we're not counting in the price, in that marginal cost. The impact on environment or society isn't priced in, so to speak. You can have two sorts of externalities, though. You can have positive externalities or negative externality. A very common example of a positive externality is the vaccine. I might make a private choice to get a vaccine. Of course, I'm to get vaccinated, and I'm expecting that I will get sick less. Maybe this is the flu vaccine. I'm expected to get the flu less because I've taken the vaccine. And of course, scientific studies have shown that you do get the flu much less if you take the vaccine. But there's a positive externality from that as well. More people who take that vaccine, it means the less other people, third parties, will get sick because we get that herd immunity thing happening. So each person who gets a vaccine, for that, there's a positive externality. And that would be the reason why governments often subsidize people getting vaccines, often giving them the vaccines for free, because there's such a large third-party positive effect, that is, positive externality to society involved with getting vaccinated. There's also, of course, negative externalities. That's when a cost is incurred by a third party from a choice I make privately. And I have a very strange AI-produced example here, perhaps, of your very bad neighbors. And, of course, they're just enjoying themselves, having quite an incredibly loud and disturbing kind of party. And if they're your neighbors, they're just minding their own business and enjoying themselves. But if you have to live beside that, that's a bad effect on you. It's noisy, it's disturbing. That's a negative externality on you. Even though they're just having a party and sort of minding their own business, you suffer a cost as their neighbor. So that's a private choice that leads to overuse and overproduction of that kind of good. So a government might want to create noise laws to sort of minimize the production of partying like that crazy at your home. That's a negative externality. Of course, we're talking about environmental economics here, so we focus more on environmental externalities. So here's the cover of a World Wildlife Fund report, The Environmental Impacts of Sugar Production. Turns out, sugar production, it pollutes land, makes it less bountiful. You can grow less food on the land, which causes food insecurity, often for local populations. It can poison waterways and ecosystems, making them less useful, depleting fish stocks and other resources. At the end of the day, it can be damaging to grow sugarcane and produce sugar, and that has impacts on other people who might want to do farming in other areas, or fishers who might want to use resources and they find themselves having less fish because of chemicals spilling into the water, or just the fish themselves. And we have to decide whether we think we count other species impacts as valuable in our economic calculations as well. And you can think about how you feel about that. However, if we take in my original calculation that caused me to buy 2 cotton candies at $5 each, in that calculation, we weren't taking into account these environmental externalities. Maybe if we add that up, it makes the true cost, the social total cost of 1 cotton candy go up to $7. And if that's the case, if you remember our last example, I enjoy cotton candy to what I think is a $7 threshold. That would mean I wouldn't buy that second one. We would change the price of cotton candy to include those larger costs that weren't in it. The cost of cotton candy that I have to pay now would be $7 if environmental economists were responsible for setting the price of cotton candy to take into account all costs. And there, since it's $7, I would only buy one cotton candy. I would not purchase the second cotton candy because I only get $5 worth of benefit if we think back to our last example. So what in the end of the day we have is I'm purchasing less cotton candy, which is a good thing because that is adjusting for the environmental impacts of that cotton candy production. Now, public goods and commons are types of goods that are very much related to externalities like we just discussed. Let's show you that. Okay, public goods. What is a public good? Well, that's a good that has positive externalities. So public goods tend to be underproduced in markets. They're non-excludable. What does that mean? I can't stop you from using them if I use them. We'll get to some examples that will make sense, but private property is something I can exclude you from. This is my phone. I can make you not use it. That's excluding it. If I'm using it, it means you can't use it. So it is excludable. Nobody can be excluded from using goods that are public goods, though. They're not private property, and it may be nearly impossible even to make them into private property. Public goods are also non-rival. That's that thing where if I'm using it, you can't, right? If I'm swimming in the ocean, you can swim in the ocean too. But if I'm using my cell phone, you can't use my cell phone. So the ocean is non-rival, public good. My cell phone, that's a private good. It's rival. Commons are a type of property that are very similar to public goods. But commons, they are non-excludable, like the ocean, but they are rival. That is, they can be used up. When someone uses them, it means someone else can't or can at least use them somewhat less. Let's get into some examples here. Here's a public good, clean air. It's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. I can't stop you from using the clean air. And when I breathe the clean air, you can still breathe it too. So it's non-rivalrous. Let's look at fish stocks. This is a commons. It's not excludable. Imagine fish stocks, say in international waters. I can go out and catch fish, and so can you. It's hard to exclude you from catching those fish, especially since fish move around and they might move from my territory to your territory. So that is, they are non-excludable. But fish stocks are rivalrous. If I catch all the fish, there are none left for you to catch. That makes it a commons instead of a public good. Now, there are a lot of similarities between public goods and commons, so let's just go through some examples. These are public goods that are often used as examples. National defense. Okay, so that's non-rivalrous, and I can't exclude anybody from using it. For example, if we live in a country with an army, it presumably is protecting all of the members of that country with that army. Once you have the army, everybody in the country is protected. And if it's protecting me, that doesn't mean it's not protecting you. So it's a public good. Same with police force. Of course, there's all sorts of political and important issues with armies and police forces we're glossing over here. But this is just sort of a meta kind of example of what a public good would look like. Vaccinations, as we have discussed, I can have them if you have them. And if we all have them, it's good. the benefits are shared by all. Education is also a public good. We all benefit from those around us being more educated. The economy tends to do better in that case, and we all benefit from the better economy, so to speak. Same with science and knowledge, technologies. Let's see, and clean air, as we've already discussed. Those are public goods. Fish stocks can be used up, so therefore that's a commons. I can access them, I can catch the fish, so can you. I can't stop you from doing that naturally, but we can use up that resource, so that's a commons. Same for imagining, say, a forested area that's not private property. Anyone can go there, cut down those trees. I can't stop them, but we can use up the forest. That's a commons. Often used example is grazing land for cattle. That's a commons. Wildlife, hunting. People can hunt, presumably, if there are no laws, freely. Nobody can naturally stop anyone from hunting in public lands. However, those wildlife will be depleted. They run out. Even space on a beach. Imagine a nice private beach. I can use that beach and you can. That's public land. But eventually it can be filled up, so much so that it's completely unenjoyable. So that becomes a commons. And you can think of traffic and traffic jams. I can use the highways, so can you. I can't stop you from using them, but eventually they get filled up and we get traffic jams, so that's a commons as well. I hope you notice that there's sort of a blurry line between public goods and commons. Eventually, maybe you could think of a beach as a public good when it's pretty empty, but once it starts to get full, it seems to be act more like a commons, for example. A very famous issue for environmental economists is the tragedy of the commons. So let's look at that one. Overgrazing is often the result of a tragedy of the commons. Imagine this picture here is public land. Anyone has access to it, and we're all farmers and we own cows. Well, cows got to eat, so I'm going to let my cows go in this public grazing land, and so are you. But eventually, there's incentive for all of us to use the free public grazing land, so it ends up being overgrazed, and it's useless to all of our cows. We can't use it for grazing our cows any longer in that case. Overfishing is a similar thing. The oceans, there's plenty of fish. I can't stop you from fishing, but eventually if we all get in there and our trawlers get bigger and bigger, we will empty the oceans of fish, and there's no fish for anyone. We haven't managed that resource properly. Here's a headline related to that. Both the climate crisis and overfishing, those are actually tragedies of the commons. The climate is increasingly thought of as a commons. 60,000 African penguins starved to death after sardine numbers collapsed. So the fish got overfished, and the changing of acidification and temperature in the oceans from climate change caused a plummeting of fish stocks. Fish feed penguins, penguins collapse. So starving penguins, we have to decide, do we think the externalities of fishing matter to us as policy experts if they impact penguins, or is it just humans we're concerned about? So there's a lot of ethics involved with environmental economics such as that. But also science. If it's killing penguins, is it also doing harm to other species, and do those harms sort of bend back and impact humans and our ability to feed ourselves? So there's a lot of detailed science and calculation that has to go into environmental economics. You can't just assume the market's going to correct everything properly, so you have to use your brains and you have to use science to really get to the answers of what we should do about these externalities in these cases. What kind of solutions come from environmental economics? Well, they prefer, just like Keynesians, they prefer to create private property rights. So they'd use this kind of argument. They'll show you a picture, for example, here and say, look, this land on the right, that's common land. It's a commons, and there's a tragedy of the commons happening there. It's overgrazed. But the one on the right, we just divided that up and made it to private property. Once it's private property, the owner has an incentive to make it viable long term, so they can always use it to graze their cattle, so they won't put so many cattle on that private property, so that they can use it year after year after year. And there you have a sustainable resource use because you've created private property. The second choice, the second best choice, usually according to environmental economists, is using government regulation or incentives to dissuade people from using it. So maybe they tax farmers for each cow that are grazing public land, for example. That tax would reduce the incentive for farmers to use that public land. Here's another example. You could allow each farmer only to graze a certain amount of cattle on the common land, reducing it in total. So a couple of different options, a tax or just a quota there. Here's an example of a quota, and it's also kind of creating a private property of animals. Here's a hunting license from the province of Ontario in Canada, right? That gives the person who owns this hunting license, who purchased it, the right to, say, one animal, to kill one deer, so to speak. And that would allow the government to say, we are only issuing the private property, the private right to kill one deer. We're only issuing, 20,000 of these. So we know that only 20,000 deer will be killed, and presumably you could even sell your right to kill deer to other people, which makes this into a tradable market commodity. You've created something that's really hard to make into a commodity. You've made it into a commodity that people can trade on the market, and you've capped it at 20,000 deer killed, so you know that there's not going to be any more than that killed, assuming people obey the law. Let's look at the issue of pollution and climate change. It's a similar situation. The global climate is a public good. Clean air is a public good. A stable climate is a public good. And it's destroyed by private consumption of a product that has negative externalities. What's that product? Any kind of fossil fuel that puts carbon into the air. We've got a picture of garbage, and you could make similar arguments with garbage control, but we're talking about climate right now. What would environmental economists suggest you do? Well, first, you make that good a private property. And there's a cap and trade policy that's involved in doing that, and we'll look at that a bit. The second thing is you can regulate and fine people who pollute. That's something like a carbon tax. Okay, so here's a cap and trade policy. What the government does in a cap and trade, similar to what we were discussing with that example of wildlife, is they say you can only pollute so much. You can only put this amount of CO2, greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere, and that's it. And we will divide the rights to do that. This is like a hunting permit. Divide the rights to pollute and give it to all the producers, the factories in this area who want to burn fossil fuels in order to fuel their production. So imagine, for simplicity, we only have 2 factories in the area, and they want to burn fossil fuels to produce whatever good they're producing. Here we have, each has this allowable amount of pollution that they can emit. The government said, each of you guys has the right to pollute to this amount. Here is your certificate of your right to pollute that amount. Nobody can pollute more than that in total. And this with the other factory, same amount. Each factory gets the same amount. But there is a difference here. One is a relatively clean factory and one is a relatively dirty factory. The factory on the left is making emissions, but they're not even using their complete allowance. The factory on the right, well, they're making more emissions than their cap. So what might happen? This factory on the right will be able to purchase the right to pollute from this other factory. They will sell half their carbon credits, so to speak, to this factory. So the factory on the left actually makes money from being clean. The factory on the right has to pay extra money for polluting. And that's how a cap and trade policy works. And it can be highly effective if you think about it. From 2017 to 2025, Tesla, for example, made over $10 billion selling emission credits in the United States to other manufacturers. This is the same process. Auto manufacturers were given a certain amount of emissions that are maximum. They were divided. There were credits of pollution divided up amongst auto manufacturers in the United States. Many, especially those who make cars based on fossil fuels, exceeded their limits and had to purchase clean energy credits from Tesla year after year after year. And it's arguable that Tesla wouldn't even be a major car company right now without the advantage of this government policy of carbon credits, right? Of course, the other alternative is much simpler than a cap and trade. It's just having a tax. If you want to put carbon into the air by burning greenhouse gases, the government will charge you some money. And of course, that makes it more expensive to burn that carbon and put that into the air. So the incentive is for people to burn less. Okay, so let's sort of dig into some detail on these policies from environmental economics. First, let's look at a cap and trade policy. All right, so to remind you, a fish quota is an example of a cap and trade policy, but also so is our CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions reduction policies. And let's look at a cap on fossil fuels in this example. We could have used a cap on emissions themselves, but that gets technically kind of more complicated. So let's just pretend, this isn't usually the way it goes, but pretend the government just said, we're going to use a cap on the amount of fossil fuels that are burned in this economy. Okay, the cap is often achieved by giving companies a quota and then those certificates or carbon credits, and then those companies can trade with other companies. That can create a secondary market in carbon credits, and as we saw in the last slide, some companies can pay other companies to buy their right to pollute, so to speak. What does this look like as far as an economic diagram is concerned? This is our normal supply and demand diagram here. Price of the product. And in this case, we're looking at fossil fuels in general, imaginary fossil fuels total product. And this is how much it costs, the price of fossil fuels. And on the bottom, here is the quantity of fossil fuels that are burned in that economy. And in a normal situation, you have a supply and demand curve that look very average and normal as you would expect. At a certain price, a certain amount will be supplied because that's how expensive the item costs to produce, including just the costs that are taken into account by the producers. And the demand curve slopes down, signifying how much people are willing to pay at any price. Of course, quantity goes down as price goes up. Quantity purchase goes down as price goes up. So here you will have an equilibrium price and quantity. I've just got it labeled Q here, and the price just with a dollar sign there. And that is how much you will burn. Quantity Q, that's how much fossil fuels will be burned in your economy in a free market situation. Then the government says, nope, we're not going to burn that much quantity Q. We're going to put a cap on the amount of fossil fuels that can be used in our economy, and that cap will be here at Q2, which is, of course, less than at Q. So we've got a cap that is less than we were burning at the market equilibrium level before. And that's all we can do. So that's why it's straight up and down at Q2. That's just how much we're going to allow to be burned. And you'll see that that raises the price. As it reduces the quantity available, the price of that good becomes raised to this price. I have $B here. And that's the new price for fossil fuels. So the price of fossil fuels goes up and the amount burned goes down because of a cap and trade policy. Here's the carbon tax example. That's a tax on fossil fuels that makes them more expensive at every quantity demanded. It looks like when you do it, it just looks like your supply curve has made a leftward shift in the for petrochemicals. And the end result is less petrochemical use. And the government actually tends to return the tax to citizens, so it doesn't kind of keep the money in most carbon taxes, it returns it to citizens. So the goal of the carbon tax is that behavioral change, that is to get people to buy less chemicals. It's not really a money-making scheme. There are some problems that we'll get into in a moment, however. So here's your supply and demand curve for that petrochemical again, and here is your original market equilibrium, Q, right here. And then you have a carbon tax, and it looks like this. At every price, there is less supplied. Why? Because it's an extra cost here. So at the carbon tax, using a carbon tax, you can reduce the total amount burned of fossil fuels in your economy to Q2, and that also increases the price. So it kind of works the same as a cap and trade. There are certainly a lot of details and arguments amongst environmental economists over whether a cap and trade or a carbon tax are the best policy, and that's really important detail. One of the problems with a carbon tax, for example, is that maybe the increased price produces innovation, which makes producers be able to produce fossil fuels more cheaply, and then all of a sudden that innovation just moves this supply line right back to where it was before, which is overuse of fossil fuels. You get a slow movement from Q2 to Q, and this is just because there's not a hard cap on the amount of fossil fuels that you're burning with the carbon tax. It's just a suggestion. We're going to make it more expensive to build fossil fuels, so we hope that you'll take that suggestion and burn less with a carbon tax. But with a quota system, you actually have a quota. You just can't have any more than that used in the economy. So that makes some economists prefer a cap and trade over a carbon tax. Another common item of discussion in environmental economics is the environmental Kuznets curve. Remember, environmental economists do tend to be, like Keynesian economists, capitalists. They prefer private ownership of the means of production. They prefer a market-based economy. So they do tend, and they prefer and assume that economic growth will somehow end up cleaning up the environmental impacts that capitalist systems tend to have on the economy. So the environmental Kuznets curve was an amendment of another type of Kuznets curve by Simon Kuznets. The idea was that here on the bottom is sort of the stage of development, how much you can think of GDP per capita a country has, starting at 0 and going to a high-income country by the time you get to the right side of this diagram. And then environmental damage is on the other axis from south to north here. That's how much pollution. And the argument in pre-industrial economies, yes, as they industrialize, environmental pollution increases. Then they get to industrial levels, but once they get to be advanced economies, actually environmental impact decreases with economic growth. So that suggests that in the long run, economic growth might be the cure for environmental problems. That's a very nice argument if you believe that economic growth is a good thing and you believe that capitalist economies with sort of no brakes on their total growth are a good thing. So GDP per capita grows, eventually countries will pollute less. Why would this happen? Well, in developed countries, increased GDP per capita eventually did coincide with more regulations on emissions and other pollution. So people were looking at that in the data. And as countries have become richer, they have switched from manufacturing and farming, which pollute more and they've switched to services, selling services, which pollute less. And there's also more money available in wealthier economies to invest in cleaner technologies as countries get richer. And maybe just caring for the economy is a luxury good. So for all these reasons, many many environmental economists have suggested that there is an environmental Kuznets curve, and as countries start getting richer, they will eventually, yes, in the beginning they will pollute more, but eventually they will actually pollute less. So what's the policy prescription here? Pursue economic growth, even especially in poor countries, because eventually you will start polluting less. Now, this has led to a large, really ideological element to environmental economics around this idea of sustainable development, or you could call it green growth. And of course, this is best depicted by the Sustainable Development Goals. What do they say? Well, we don't want poverty. That's goal number one. We don't want hunger. We want good health and well-being, quality education, equality in genders, clean water, all of these wonderful things. We want to have that climate action. We want lots of fish, all represented by these different goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. But we also want this thing, economic growth. And the idea is that we can have that. And of course, if you believe the environmental Kuznets curve, we will get clean environments through economic growth, even if we have to go through a rough part to begin with. Now, that involves a little bit of a gamble, and environmental economists are very aware of this gamble. Can we sustain the amount of damage to the environment that it would take to get, especially the poorer countries in the world, to be at that level that they stop polluting or reduce their pollution, or will the earth just be so dirty by the time we get to that point that it's really pointless to have economic growth as part of our plan for a better environment and a better future for our human population. So that's one of the problems, is we just might get too dirty before we get to the clean part of the Kuznets curve. And another problem is that this, if you notice, assumes that technology is the thing that's going to make this happen. We know that as economies grow, their impact on the environment grows. That doesn't take a lot of knowledge. As something grows, it takes up space. A human economy is getting bigger as it grows. As you get more gross domestic product, the human economy is getting bigger. It'll therefore have more environmental impact, unless you have something. And that something that's assumed to be the kind of savior for environmental economists is technology. Technology will make it so that we can have economic growth that does not impact the environment, and hopefully eventually we can have economic growth that will even impact the environment less and less and less every year. And that's one of the main assumptions of environmental economics.